This video will explore the Gospels. The Gospels are the first 4 books in the New Testament, the second part of the Christian sacred text, the Bible. The word Gospel means good news. The word is derived from the Anglo-Saxon God spell, a good telling or a good story, which compares with the Latin or Greek words meaning good news. The Gospels are narratives concerned with the story of Jesus' life and teaching. The Gospels that made it into the biblical canon, the agreed list of books of the New Testament, were not the only accounts of Jesus' life that were written. There are at least 16 other accounts or Gospels recorded by scholars, although there could have been more. The Gospels of the New Testament were the earliest accounts of Jesus' life and teaching, and many of the other Gospel accounts that did not make it into the canon were based on them. Tradition holds that the 4 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, wrote the Gospels between the years 60 and 110 AD. The names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have been attached to the Gospels since the end of the 2nd century. They are mentioned by the writings of Clement and St. Irenaeus at that time, in a way which implies they have been in use for a while, but we cannot trace the Gospel names back to the time of writing. Therefore, scholars today generally think these titles were not given to the Gospels at the time they were written. In other words, they are not the original titles of the works. Each of the Gospels has in the title "according to," which some scholars have interpreted to mean that it is a Gospel in the conception of, for example, Matthew, rather than saying Matthew actually wrote the Gospel. In other words, it gives authority to the text. However, in general, it is taken as tradition that the authors of the Gospels were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke's Gospels are collectively called the Synoptic Gospels because they are similar in their treatment of the narrative. The similarities are evident in their structures, their content, and their wording, and the Gospel texts can be put side by side for comparison. The similarities between these 3 Gospels suggests that content has been shared amongst them, and the literary relationship is close. Jesus encouraged his disciples to teach his message rather than to write it down, and therefore the Gospels are predated by an oral Gospel, or a message passed on by word of mouth. That the disciples did this is recorded in the Acts of the Apostles, the book that follows the Gospels. This might account for some of the differences that exist between the Gospels. The similarities might be due to the existence of an earlier Gospel, which influenced these Gospels. Scholars think the Gospels of Matthew and Luke may have used the earlier Gospel of Mark, as well as another hypothetical source called Q, which has now been lost. The times at which there are differences between the accounts might be because they are in fact talking about 2 separate events, all caused by the literary style of the author, or indeed the purpose of the Gospel. The Gospel of John is distinctly different from the other 3 Gospels. The literary style is different to the other Gospels, and the focus is on the signs of Jesus' identity and mission. The 2 quotes on the screen have come to summarize the theological message of John's Gospel, or the message about God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. For God so loved the world, that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him may not perish, but may have eternal life.